Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their current or recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my great pleasure to be meeting Gregor Rohmann to talk about his work on Pirates or Privateers, a linguistic conundrum of the 15th century Baltic. Gregor received his doctorate from the University of Göttingen in 2000, and from then until 2004, he worked for the Museum of Hamburg History in Hamburg, where he was involved in curating and directing several exhibitions. During this period, he also collaborated with Spielberg TV on a documentary about Klaus Stautenbecker, the most famous pirate or privateer in the 15th century Baltic. In 2004, he returned to academia in medieval history at the University of Bielefeld and Goethe University, Frankfurt am Main, where he took his habilitation. This was also the start of his interest in late medieval semantics of the Baltic region. Since 2023, Gregor has been the Professor of Regional History, University of Rostock. His current research combines his interest in medieval semantics with analysing the work of pirates and privateers in the Baltic region, including Klaus Stautenbecker and the Whittle brothers, which sounds amazingly interesting. Gregor tells me he enjoys running, swimming and cooking and loves spending time with his family. An ideal lifestyle. Gregor.
Thank you very much.
In the papers I read for preparing this, you mention northern Germany, Scandinavian countries, Friesland, and the Hanse towns. And I did have to wonder who or what were the dominant powers of the region at that time, and where did they rule?
Well, traditionally, at least German researchers would have held the Hanse as the hegemonic actor in Northern Europe. But in fact, today we know that this is kind of a cliché conception, the conception that the German merchants had something like a monopoly on long-distance trade and also something like a political hegemony in northern Germany. We know that there were other powers and also market participants in long-distance trade. In England, naturally, France, the Netherlandish territories, and later Burgundy in the west. And in the Baltic, the Scandinavian powers, and also in the 15th century, the growing power of Poland-Lithuania, which became more and more important, and which included some very important Hanse towns, like Danzig and the Prussian towns who became Polish in the second half of the 15th century. And all these powers competed on sovereignty and on hegemony in Northern Europe.
So it was a bit coming and going, changing power structures.
Yes, it was. And dynastic quarrels and conflicts on different interests in economic interests, political interests, which all led to, well, permanent small and larger wars and conflicts, which gave people the opportunity to earn money as fighters in these conflicts.
Yes, I suppose they would. Yeah, if you were a good fighter.
If you were, right.
Yes. With all these different competing polities, there would have been different languages, different names that went beyond all the other differences. What names for armed violence at sea were used? And why was there so little agreement, consensus on what the terminology was?
Well, I think the point is that we know the distinction between pirates and privateers, which is illegitimate, illicit robbery versus legitimate, well, violence, say violence, if not robbery. But this difference is only a product of early modern state building and of the emergence of kind of a maritime law. Before this, or even within the process of the making of this distinction, we have other terms used in different languages. For example, in German as well as in English, a very important term was rover, which did not really mean robbery, but more just like kind of an adventurer. In German, we have the word Auslieger, which is just like, well, people lying in wait at sea, which was usually used for the ships commissioned by maritime powers to control the sea. We have, in fact, mercenaries, in German Söldner. And most common, we have the people lying in wait at sea termed or denoted as servants. The servants of the English king, or the people of the English king, the Leute in German. So people were denoted depending on who commissioned them. And besides that, we have terms like the Whittle brothers, which meant professional fighters at sea. And a very common term was the loose party, which meant unbound fighters, people without a commission. And these people, the loose party, was held as the most dangerous group in this game. And all these terms were used very specifically to negotiate the status of fighters at sea. And this is what I'm trying to figure out, which term was used to denote which status and which social setting.
Yeah, that really leads directly to my next question, because you're talking about languages which change between the native language. But even today, our language changes between social groups. The English would call it classes.
Yes.
Was there a lot of linguistic difference in regard to armed violence at sea related to the social group of the speaker?
I think this is not so easy to detect, right? Because the sources we have mostly come from the upper classes, and we only have the words they used in most times. So even terms we would consider as being used by the lower classes turn out to have been part of the language of the upper classes. For example, Lickedeler or Whittle brothers, especially in German, these Lickedeler and Whittle brothers, both terms are very often perceived of as being self-conceptions of the fighters, but they are not. We can see that these terms come from the Hanseatic sources and from the sources of political entities, and they use them to denote the fighters. And in fact, we don't really know how the fighters called themselves. And we have no sources for fighters calling themselves, for example, Lickedelers or Whittle brothers.
Certainly in the world that I came from, pirates, privateers, and street robbers, highwaymen, always had a bit of a mystique, a bit of a glamour about them.
Yes, yes.
Did the pirates in the Baltic region also have that kind of glamour aura about them?
Well, I do think that these people, these, well, violent entrepreneurs in the maritime sphere were simply businessmen in the end. I think the glamour, the fascination, which is deeply rooted in the concept of piracy, comes from, on the one hand, from antique legend from Dionysus, who was a pirate and a sort of transgressive figure, right? And on the other hand, it is a product of early modern humanist construction of the term pirate. Our concept of piracy, the Pirates of the Caribbean, right, is sort of a merger of antique and early modern myths, which convey all these glamorous, fascinating aspects of a pirate as a transgressive figure who goes beyond all borders. That's in fact the core of the fascination of piracy.
I'm just wondering, was there any form of insurance against pirates or indemnity against privateers that could be claimed by the people being attacked?
From the 16th century onwards, we know something like insurances against piracy in the Mediterranean. And then also in the north for ships going to the Mediterranean. But this is only a concept from, I think, from the 1570s onwards. Before that, you don't have insurances, but people try to, well, secure their trade by parting it. Just like you don't put all eggs in one casket, but you put your stuff on 10 ships instead of one. And if one ship is taken, then okay, you can try to get it back, but it's not that hard for you as a merchant. And you also partition the investments in ships. You don't own one ship, but you own 10 parts in 10 ships. This is the most common way of trying to cope with the problem of piracy or maritime violence.
And I suppose the ships would be quite small and hug the coast.
Yes, yes. Well, what we are talking about is mostly not really happening on the high seas, but in a more kind of amphibic space near the coast. And well, first the threat of maritime violence is happening there, but also this is a way of trying to secure stuff and trying to cope with the problem.
Who had jurisdiction over the rivers?
The adjacent powers, which were mostly competing on this jurisdiction. You got the concept of the stream, in German Strom, Flumen Latin, which is a legal concept of sort of sovereignty over a mercantile route, a river or a sea route near a coast. And people tried to kind of monopolize this stream sovereignty. And connected to this was also the task to secure this route and to drive out the loose party from your stream. And we know about, I had lots of sources of one political entity telling the other, well, we heard about loose party gathering in your stream. Please try to secure the sea route so that our merchants could go there. So there was kind of a concept of, well, not really sovereignty, but of kind of responsibility for a sea route.
So I can see where the privateer, which is commissioned by one sovereign power, could be seen as pirates by the sovereign
Yes.
power next door.
Yes. The Utligers, the people lying in wait at sea of one power, are the pirates of the other in many, many cases. Because if you send someone out to control your stream, this includes to have people pay taxes, customs, and stuff like that. And so sometimes you have to enforce this. It's always the question, is someone an admiral or a pirate? You always have the admirals denoted as pirates by the other side. If you denote someone as a pirate, this is not a legal term, but it's an argument. And this is the core problem of what we're doing. Also, my colleagues, like a very important American colleague, Emily Sommer-Tai, who did the pioneer studies on all these problems in the 1990s. You had the question, who was a pirate or who was outlawed? And Emily once said, well, the pirates were those who lost their heads in the end.
A good point. How and where were laws introduced that covered maritime trade that everyone could agree on? And when did states begin to have the accepted authority to enforce maritime law?
Well, a proper maritime law in a global sense has only been introduced in the 19th century. Before that, we have kind of competing powers, especially in the process of the European expansion from the 16th century onwards. You have competing powers, imperial entities trying to enforce their claims by claiming to be something like a global power enforcing law. And only in the 1850s, all these powers came together and agreed upon a common law of the seas, which only became possible because all these powers had kind of partitioned the world. And the European powers, in fact, the European powers plus the US controlled the world then.
But the Baltic is still, well, it must have been intensely competed over when you think of all the different polities around the Baltic.
Yes, it was. And as I tried to figure out in the beginning, you have different powers competing for control over the Baltic, the Scandinavians, especially Denmark and later on Sweden. You have the Hanse, you have Poland, Lithuania rising from the early 15th century onwards, and all these try to control parts of the Baltic or the entire Baltic. And especially the ways into the Baltic, the Öresund, which was again and again the point where the wars began, right? And around 1400, the time of my pirates, especially the parts of the Hanse, the northern German towns, and the northern German political entities, the other entities competed with Denmark on the control of the Öresund, which is in fact the control of the entire trade in the Baltic.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the Vittel brothers, who I will admit I hadn't heard of before, but you suggest there's a popular perception that the Vittel brothers were the Baltic equivalent of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Who were the Vittel brothers? Where did their name come from? Because it's a very strange name to me.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of their legend is based on reality and how much of it is just legend? And I suppose I'm also very curious, how do the legends live on in popular culture today?
Well, these are questions not so easy to answer because it's somewhat complicated what the Vittel brothers in historical reality really were. In popular perception, they are perceived of as kind of a brotherhood of pirates, and in this sense, the German equivalent to the Pirates of the Caribbean. They are said to have emerged during a war between Denmark and the northern German Duchy of Mecklenburg. The Danish queen or regent Margaret, Queen of Norway, and the Dukes of Mecklenburg competed for the Swedish crown. And in this war, which started in the late 1380s, the Wittel brothers, as fighters of the Mecklenburg dukes, are said to have emerged. And in 1395, there was a truce, and then legend has it that they lost their commissions and became pirates because they carried on taking ships and fighting. In fact, we know today that after the truce of June 1395, they did not really lose the Mecklenburg patronage, but they carried on fighting in kind of a guerrilla war against the Danes. So what they did was, well, kind of semi-autonomous fighting. And we also know that some of them did change sides and fought for Margaret of Denmark then, and that they even fought for some Hanse towns. They also fought for Lübeck and Hamburg. So we would say today that these Wittel brothers were not a company of pirates, but more or less a group of maritime fighters, mercenaries, one could say, fighting for different polities in these wars around 1400. And the legend of the Wittel brothers as kind of a German equivalent of the Pirates of the Caribbean, well, I think it's so fascinating because it conveys also political concepts of kind of a good robber, right? A social rebel, especially Klaus Störtebeker, the alleged leader of the Wittel brothers, is conceptualized as kind of a German Robin Hood. And this figure is very important in German popular perception until today, especially in the former GDR, because in the GDR, Störtebeker and the Wittel brothers were seen as kind of forerunners of socialism. And this is what makes them so interesting for people until today.
And yet you said earlier, Stutterbeker was from Gdansk.
Yes, he was. He is often said to have been from Wismar in Mecklenburg, but we know from the sources that he was a shipmaster and businessman from Gdansk.
And the way they change sides does make them sound more mercenary than independent businessmen.
Yeah. As far as we know the names and where they came from, most of them started as noblemen from Mecklenburg and Holstein, from northern Germany and from Friesland. But then they act like, well, the more powerful ones act rather like warlords, right? They try to build a power on their own, troops on their own, and then they change sides depending on the political development. They see, Margaret is becoming stronger and stronger, so I have to side with her. And some of them we know end as Swedish noblemen, just like bailiffs in Finland or in Sweden, commissioned by Queen Margaret.
But I wonder what would drive a nobleman, presumably someone quite well off, to become a sea captain, a mercenary, a hired army.
Well, I think it was just about violent entrepreneurship, right? I mean, if you are a nobleman in the later Middle Ages, acting violently is part of your socialization and part of your job, one could say. And if your lord, the duke, wages war, you side him as part of your feudal obligations. But then he loses, and you have to make a living, and then you change sides. Well, some of them did, some did not, but many of them did. And if you are someone like this Störtebeker from Gdansk, who was not a nobleman as far as we see, but an urban burger, well, for him, I think it's only a job. You know, he's a shipmaster in mercantile business, and besides that, he um, does kind of a security job or a mercenary job for different commissioners. In 1400, he's commissioned by the Count of Holland to fight against Hamburg. And a few years earlier, apparently, he fights for the Mecklenburgians. Later on, he fights for the Prussian towns against England. So he's kind of a professional businessman in maritime violence.
You mean cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war?
Yes.
Funny thing is, I'd always assumed that the dogs of war were just land-based, and now you've made me realize they can be sea-based as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And the funny thing is that people in contemporary sources always try to differentiate between mercenaries and these people just like Störtebeker. They tried to figure out, well, are these guys Whittle brothers or are they mercenaries? Or are they people lying in wait at sea or Utligers? Because in their perception, it was a difference, maybe only depending on the way they were paid, right? Did they get a fixed loan or did they only get parts of the booty or something? And I'm trying to figure out, but I'm not really able to say what was the difference between a mercenary and a Whittle brother.
Yes, now I see the semantics of armed violence at sea is totally interwoven with the actors concerned and with the increase of rule of law.
Yes, because the law is in the semantics in a way. The semantics are expressions of how people try to rule life at sea and how people try to negotiate the rules of how they live together. And so I think if you analyze semantics, you could better understand the way the laws emerged, right?
Yeah, I can now understand how your research could be just long term, so rich in many ways. That is fascinating.
We even have charters, just like peace treaties between noblemen from Friesland and the Hanse towns. And they explicitly say, well, we, the Frisian noblemen, the captains, are not allowed to hire, and then there's a whole list of terms to hire mercenaries, Whittle brothers, fighters, or how they could be denoted, right? So even contemporary people had to cope with this semantic conundrum.
When was the word pirate introduced? When did it become the accepted term for what on land could be called illegal trespass or theft with violence?
Again, one would have to differentiate between the several vernaculars, but one could say pirate is first only a Latin term used by savants in order to show their erudition, right? Just like Saxo Grammaticus in the 12th century uses the term pirate in order to show, look, people, I read Cicero and I know how to use it. He uses the term to denote the Danish fighters, the Vikings. So it's a positive term for him. And then it becomes a negative term, a disqualifying term in Latin sources. from the 12th century onwards, especially in the Baltic, for the enemies of the Christians. They are called pirates if they defend themselves against the Latin Christians. Only from the late 15th century onwards, piracy becomes a legal term in the vernaculars, in English, in French, in German as well. There is a fascinating book by Pierre Prétout from La Rochelle from 2023, I think, L'invention de la piraterie au Moyen Âge. He was able to show how the term piracy was introduced into the French language from the late 15th century onwards as part of the way the French king tried to gain control over the coasts of the French realm. And in England, you have a concept very similar to piracy, but not the term, within the Statute of Truces in 1415, I guess. But they don't use the term piracy. This is, again, only introduced, I think, 2 generations later. And in German as well, you have the term piracy not until, I think, the early 16th century. They use rover and they use sea rover, Seerover. But rover is less illegitimate. A rover is more an adventurer, right? He's not really illicit what he does.
Yes. I know there are many English folk songs about roving.
Yes.
And we're going a roving. Yeah, it brings a different meaning to those old songs. Gregor, for my final question, and it must be the final because I'm very aware of the time, you have mentioned so often the rule of law. And development of the rule of law, which is frequently linked to the concept of state building and slowly constructing rules of trade and mercantile business that enable central control, state control, to increase authority, which presumably would help the wider population. In one of your papers, you dispute that the rule of law and trade and maritime law were not directly connected.
Well, the paper you mentioned, I think it's from 2019, which I wrote together with Thomas Hebelholm and Philipp Höhn. And what we wanted back then in 2019 was to show that it's not the political authorities who introduce this differentiation between pirate and privateer, but it's the merchants themselves. Also, the merchants act violently at sea. Primarily, all these conflicts are conflicts between merchants, and these are mostly conflicts concerning access to markets. And so what we wanted to show was that the difference between piracy and privateering in this sense was not only about state building, but more about market building or market access. Well, in a way, we used new institutional economics, just like Douglas North, their concepts of the emergence of states out of what merchants themselves did in order to rule their business. Admittedly, now 5 or 6 years later, I would say that we were not completely right when we tried to prove this, right? We discussed this several times with several colleagues, and today I would say, well, it is about state building. State building performed by merchants and their towns, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. It's the Hanse towns who become the actors of state building in a way. So today I would say it is about state building. It is about the enforcement of a state monopoly on violence. But this state building is done by the mercantile classes, and they have to introduce the difference between licit and illicit violence in order to reshape the whole setting of their business. In the medieval sense of the word, all merchants are also violent actors, even if only potentially, right? They are all able to use violence. And in a early modern or modern concept, the merchants delegate this function to the state. And in this sense, one could describe the process of state building by looking at how piracy emerged as a concept.
Fascinating. Yeah, that link between rule of law, state building, mercantile activity. It all comes down, as one US president once said, it's about the economy.
Yes, yes. This is what we wanted to show, but maybe we went too far by claiming that it's not about state building. I think today I would say it is about state building, but state building by economic actors.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because the economic actors need the state and the state
Yes.
needs the economic actors.
Yes.
And on that very interesting and incredibly modern note, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Gregor. It's been absolutely fascinating. And my big thanks to you to coming on to the MECERN podcast and talking about your research into pirates, privateers, and all of the others, that linguistic conundrum of the 15th century Baltic.
Well, thank you for it was a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. And my thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting, informative, and fascinating as I did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or current research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you would like to talk about it to MECERN, please do contact me through the MECERN board or website administrators. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.